Picture this. You are 7 years old, standing in the cold stone corridor of St. Agatha's Convent in northern France in the year 1228. Candlelight flickers against walls carved with scenes of martyred saints, their faces twisted in eternal agony. Your small hand clutches a wooden doll, the last gift from a mother you will never see again. What you don't know is that in the next few hours, everything you believe about safety, about God's love, about the very nature of childhood itself, will be destroyed forever. The other children move past you like ghosts, their heads shaved, their feet bare against the freezing stones. They don't speak. They don't smile. Their eyes hold depths of knowledge that no child should possess. You notice the fresh welts across their backs, the way they flinch when footsteps approach, the careful distance they maintain from the black-robed figures gliding through the halls like predators hunting prey. What awaits you behind these holy walls is not salvation, but systematic destruction. You are about to discover that medieval convents, institutions supposedly dedicated to God's work, operated some of history's most sophisticated child abuse networks. Between 1100 and 1500, an estimated 40,000 children disappeared into convent systems across Europe. The youngest victims were barely 4 years old. The oldest were 14. The average survival rate to adulthood was less than 30%. Your wooden doll will be taken tonight. Your name will be replaced with a number. Your identity will be systematically erased and rebuilt to serve appetites that hide behind religious devotion. You are Marguerite, though by dawn you will answer only to the name they give you, and your story reveals the horrifying truth about what happened when absolute religious power combined with complete social immunity to create machines designed to consume childhood itself. Before we follow Marguerite into this darkness that consumed tens of thousands of children across medieval Europe, if you're drawn to history's hidden truths that textbooks refuse to acknowledge, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Your support truly means a lot to me. Between 1100 and 1500, an estimated 40,000 children vanished into what medieval records euphemistically called houses of spiritual education across France, England, Germany, and the Italian states. The youngest documented victim was 4-year-old Agnes of Normandy, given to St. Marie Convent to pay her family's debt to God. The oldest was 14-year-old Thomas of Yorkshire, whose crime was being born to parents who questioned church taxation. The average time a child survived in these institutions before death, madness, or complete psychological destruction was 18 months. These numbers come from Vatican archives unsealed only in 1998, but they represent merely the cases deemed worthy of record-keeping. The economic engine driving this system was brutally simple. Families could discharge debts, both financial and spiritual, by offering their children as oblates to religious houses. Convents received not only free labor, but also payments from families desperate to avoid excommunication or financial ruin. A single child could generate income equivalent to 5 years of peasant wages through fees, donations, and the resale of trained servants to wealthy households. The church hierarchy actively encouraged these arrangements, viewing child oblation as both profitable and spiritually beneficial. The selection criteria followed predictable patterns that reveal the system's true purpose. Beautiful children commanded higher fees and received priority placement in convents with wealthy patrons. Intelligent children were valued for complex tasks and record-keeping, but most disturbing were the specific physical requirements documented in convent intake records, criteria that had nothing to do with spiritual development, and everything to do with serving appetites that dared not speak their name in daylight. The geographic network spanned the entirety of medieval Christendom, with over 300 documented convent operations specializing in child ablation. Routes connected institutions across national boundaries, allowing for the transfer of children who became too recognizable or too damaged for their original locations. Survival accounts describe a sophisticated transportation system where children were moved in covered wagons between convents, their destinations unknown even to the drivers charged with delivering them. Marguerite's selection followed the standard pattern documented in the records of St. Agatha's Convent. At 7 years old, she possessed the combination of beauty, intelligence, and family desperation that made her ideal merchandise. Her father owed the church significant taxes after a poor harvest, while her mother faced accusations of practicing folk healing that bordered on heresy. The local priest offered a solution that seemed merciful, a way to clear both debts through the gift of their daughter to God's service. Upon arrival at St. Agatha's, Marguerite experienced what surviving records call the preparation period, a carefully designed process intended to break down resistance while maintaining the appearance of religious instruction. She was immediately separated from her possessions, told that earthly attachments hindered spiritual growth. Her clothing was replaced with a rough, brown tunic that marked her as property of the institution. Her beautiful golden hair was shaved completely, ostensibly to prevent vanity, but actually to remove any distinguishing features that might help her remember her former identity. Within her first week, Marguerite understood the true nature of her situation through a combination of whispered warnings from other children and direct observation of the convent's daily operations. She learned that the locked chambers beneath the chapel served purposes that had nothing to do with prayer. She discovered that certain visiting priests showed unusual interest in the youngest children. She realized that the screaming she heard at night was not the result of spiritual ecstasy, but of suffering so profound that even the thick stone walls could not contain it. The rules that governed her new existence made no sense until she understood their true purpose. Children were forbidden from speaking during daylight hours, ensuring that they could not share information or coordinate resistance. They were required to bathe together under supervision, supposedly for cleanliness, but actually for evaluation purposes that served the appetites of those who paid premium prices for access to fresh arrivals. They were subjected to daily spiritual examinations conducted in private chambers, sessions that left the examined children withdrawn and terrified, but which were recorded in convent ledgers as evidence of religious dedication. The process that transformed Marguerite from a beloved daughter into a commodified object followed precise stages, refined over centuries of institutional practice. Medieval convents had perfected techniques for psychological destruction that would not be formally understood by psychology until the 20th century, but their effectiveness was demonstrated by the thousands of children who emerged from these institutions as hollow shells programmed for absolute obedience. First came the spiritual naming ceremony, conducted with elaborate religious ritual to disguise its true purpose as identity erasure. Marguerite's birth name was declared a vanity that separated her from God's love. She was rechristened Penitenta, a name that reduced her entire existence to the concept of perpetual atonement for sins she had never committed. Her wooden doll, her last connection to maternal love, was burned during the ceremony while she was forced to watch, told that destroying earthly attachments was necessary for spiritual purity. The prohibition against speaking her family's names was enforced through increasingly severe punishments, until even thinking of her mother and father became a source of physical pain. Second came the physical modifications designed to mark her as convent property, while serving the specific preferences of those who paid for access to the children. Her head remained shaved, not for spiritual reasons, but because certain patrons preferred the vulnerability it created. Her feet were kept bare even in winter, ostensibly for humility, but actually because the constant cold made children more compliant and easier to control. Most disturbing were the regular health examinations, conducted by visiting physicians who showed far more interest in evaluating the children's development than in treating any actual ailments. Third came the psychological conditioning that broke down Marguerite's ability to think of herself as an individual human being deserving of protection or care. She was assigned a number, 47, which replaced her name in all daily interactions. She was taught that her every breath was a debt owed to the church for the privilege of existence. She was told repeatedly that her family had rejected her, that they had paid the convent to take her away because she was unwanted and burdensome. These lies were reinforced through forged letters supposedly from her parents, documents that expressed relief at being freed from the responsibility of raising such a difficult child. Marguerite's education in her new role began with tasks that seemed almost innocent to observers, but served darker purposes known only to the institution's inner circle. She was taught to serve wine with particular grace, movements that emphasized her small size and childish beauty. She learned to sing hymns in positions that displayed her vulnerability while maintaining the appearance of religious devotion. She was trained in massage techniques, supposedly for treating the ailments of elderly nuns, but actually for preparing her to serve the physical needs of visitors who paid premium rates for such personal attention. The other children in St. Agatha's had developed a sophisticated system of silent communication that allowed them to share warnings and survival information without alerting their captors. Through subtle gestures and carefully placed objects, they taught Marguerite which visitors to avoid completely, which nuns showed signs of sadistic behavior, and which areas of the convent became dangerous after dark. But perhaps most importantly, they taught her the art of psychological absence, the ability to retreat so deeply into her own mind that her body could endure whatever was done to it while her spirit remained temporarily protected. But the most insidious aspect of the system was how it made children complicit in their own abuse through carefully designed reward structures that created psychological dependency on their captors. Children who performed their duties with enthusiasm received better food, warmer blankets, and protection from the worst violations. Those who showed resistance faced not only punishment themselves, but witnessed other children suffer for their defiance. This created a horrifying dynamic where survival required not just submission, but active participation in maintaining the system that destroyed them. On the 15th day of her confinement, Marguerite experienced what the convent euphemistically called advanced spiritual instruction, a session conducted in the underground chambers that left her understanding exactly what her future held. The visiting priest who conducted her instruction explained that her body was a temple that must be consecrated through service to God's representatives on earth. The pain she experienced was described as purification, the fear she felt as evidence of the devil being driven from her flesh. When she cried for her mother, she was told that earthly families were obstacles to divine love, and that her new family of holy brothers and sisters would provide all the affection she needed. What Marguerite discovered during her first month at St. Agatha's was not random cruelty, but a sophisticated machine designed to extract maximum profit from systematically destroying childhood innocence. The convent operated according to schedules and procedures documented in ledgers that read like business accounts, with children classified by age, appearance, and specialized training in categories that served the specific demands of a clientele willing to pay extraordinary sums for access to sanctified suffering. The daily routine began before dawn with what was called morning purification, a ritual that prepared children for their duties through techniques designed to ensure absolute compliance. Children were awakened by bells and immediately subjected to ice-cold water baths that shocked their systems into a state of heightened fear and vulnerability. They were then required to confess sins they had committed during sleep, imaginary transgressions that reinforced their sense of inherent guilt and unworthiness. Those who could not produce adequate confessions faced punishments that served as examples to the others. The hierarchy among the convent's staff was carefully maintained through a system that gave each level of authority specific permissions and responsibilities in the abuse of children. Senior nuns, those who had proven their loyalty through years of participation, were granted access to the most profitable children and the wealthiest patrons. Junior staff members were required to demonstrate their commitment by personally conducting punishments and violations, ensuring their complicity in silence. Visiting clergy were treated as honored guests whose every desire was accommodated, regardless of how those desires might impact the children forced to fulfill them. Most disturbing was the record-keeping system that treated children like inventory in a warehouse operation. Each child's file contained detailed information about their physical development, psychological condition, and specialized skills, along with notes about patron preferences and premium services. Marguerite's file, discovered centuries later in Vatican archives, describes her as Item 47, acquired via debt forgiveness, suitable for advanced instruction, commanding premium rates due to exceptional appearance and malleable temperament. The underground chambers served multiple functions that revealed the true scope of the convent's operations. The lower levels contained cells where children were held in isolation as punishment or preparation for special sessions. The middle levels housed the quarters where visiting patrons conducted their business with selected children, rooms equipped with restraints and implements that served no religious purpose. The deepest level contained the disposal areas where children who had outlived their usefulness or suffered fatal injuries were quietly eliminated, their remains consecrated and buried in unmarked graves. Marguerite was forced to witness the fate that awaited children who attempted resistance or who simply aged beyond their patrons' preferences. She watched as 12-year-old Benedict, who had tried to escape during his second month of confinement, was subjected to what the nuns called corrective spiritual discipline. The session lasted 3 days and left Benedict unable to speak or recognize his own name. He was subsequently transferred to what records describe as permanent contemplative service, a euphemism for children who had been psychologically destroyed beyond any possibility of recovery. The most horrifying aspect was how the system created children who not only accepted their abuse, but actively sought to please their abusers as their only source of safety and affection. Marguerite learned to anticipate the preferences of different visitors, to modify her behavior to maximize their satisfaction, and to compete with other children for the privilege of serving those whose approval might mean better treatment or temporary protection from worse fates. By her second month, Marguerite had learned to survive by becoming exactly what the system demanded, a perfectly compliant child, who existed solely to fulfill adult desires while maintaining the appearance of religious devotion. She no longer cried when separated from other children for private sessions. She no longer flinched when hands explored her body under the guise of spiritual examination. She had learned to smile when presenting herself for selection, to express gratitude for attention that filled her with terror, and to beg forgiveness for the sin of existing as anything other than an object for others' use. The final horror was not what the convent did to its victims, but the discovery of why such institutions were not only tolerated, but actively protected by the highest levels of church and secular authority. The children trapped in St. Agatha's were not victims of rogue operations, but essential components of a system that served the needs of the most powerful people in medieval society, individuals whose support was crucial for maintaining the Church's political and economic dominance. Cardinal Philippe de Montclair, one of the most influential figures in the French Church hierarchy, maintained detailed correspondence with Mother Superior Agnes, describing his specific requirements for the children he sponsored at St. Agatha's. His letters, preserved in Vatican archives, discuss children by number rather than name, and include payment schedules that reveal the extraordinary sums involved in purchasing access to systematic child abuse. One letter describes his satisfaction with Item 47's development and includes a bonus payment for exceptional service that exceeded expectations. The system's true purpose became clear through the discovery of patron lists that read like a directory of medieval power. Kings, nobles, high-ranking clergy, wealthy merchants, and influential scholars all participated in networks that used religious institutions as sources for victims who could be abused with complete impunity. The children's religious status made them simultaneously sacred and disposable, protected by their association with holy institutions, while being denied any actual protection from those institutions. What happened to Marguerite during the winter solstice celebration of 1228 represented the system at its most refined cruelty. The event, disguised as a religious festival honoring the birth of Christ, actually served as an annual gathering for the convent's most valued patrons. Children were prepared for weeks in advance, trained in specific rituals that combined religious symbolism with systematic violation. Marguerite was selected as the evening's primary offering, an honor that guaranteed her complete psychological destruction while providing maximum entertainment for the assembled guests. The ceremony began with elaborate religious pageantry that provided cover for what followed. Children dressed as angels performed hymns while being positioned for easy access by patrons who moved among them like predators selecting prey. The religious imagery served to sanctify acts that would have been recognized as monstrous in any other context, while the presence of high-ranking clergy provided theological justification for treating children as sacrificial offerings to divine will. Marguerite's role in the ceremony required her to represent innocence being consecrated to divine service, a symbolic transformation that became horrifyingly literal as the evening progressed. She was required to thank each patron for their attention, to express gratitude for pain inflicted upon her, and to beg for the privilege of serving their needs. The other children were forced to witness her degradation as preparation for their own future participation in similar events. The aftermath of that night marked the completion of Marguerite's transformation from human being to broken object. Contemporary records describe her as having achieved perfect spiritual submission, a state where resistance had been so completely eliminated that she no longer possessed any sense of individual will or identity. She had become what the system was designed to create, a living doll programmed to fulfill adult desires while maintaining the appearance of religious devotion. Marguerite's fate was recorded in the convent's disposal ledger under the date March 15, 1229. The entry reads simply, Item 47, service completed, transferred to eternal contemplation. Modern analysis suggests this was a euphemism for murder, as children who reached complete psychological breakdown were typically eliminated to make room for fresh victims. Her body was buried in the convent's consecrated ground, her grave marked only with the number that had replaced her name. The system that destroyed Marguerite operated for over 4 centuries, consuming an estimated 40,000 children before social changes and increased scrutiny finally forced its evolution into less visible forms. Similar operations existed throughout medieval Europe, protected by religious authority and sustained by the appetites of those powerful enough to demand victims while remaining immune from consequences. The system that destroyed Marguerite operated for over 400 years across medieval Europe, consuming an estimated 40,000 children whose names were deliberately erased from history. Similar institutional networks existed in every major European kingdom, from the monastery schools of England to the convent systems of the Italian states. The practice ended only when the Protestant Reformation and increased literacy made it impossible to maintain absolute secrecy about activities that required extensive documentation and coordination. These numbers represent real children with families, dreams, and futures that were systematically destroyed for profit disguised as religious service. Marguerite was recorded as Item 47, acquired via debt forgiveness, disposed March 15th. Her entire existence reduced to an accounting entry in ledgers that treated children like livestock. The Vatican archives contain thousands of similar entries, each representing a life consumed by institutionalized evil that operated under the protection of divine authority. The same mechanisms that enabled Marguerite's suffering operate today in institutions we trust, systems we support unknowingly, and organizations that use religious or educational authority to access vulnerable children, the willingness to treat children as commodities, the institutional blindness that allows systematic abuse to continue undetected, the economic incentives that override moral concerns when profits are substantial enough, the use of authority and tradition to silence victims and discredit accusers. In 2024, an estimated 1.2 million children worldwide experienced similar systematic abuse within institutional settings, that claim educational, religious, or therapeutic purposes. The locations change from medieval convents to modern residential facilities. The technologies evolve from quill pen record-keeping to digital documentation systems. The fundamental human capacity for organized cruelty against the defenseless remains constant across centuries and cultures. We remember Marguerite not as item 47, but as a 7-year-old girl who deserved protection, love, and the chance to grow into the woman she might have become. Her story survives because someone, somewhere, kept records that revealed the truth. Someone preserved evidence that proved these crimes occurred. Someone refused to let these atrocities disappear into convenient historical amnesia. Next week, we examine the systematic torture of child laborers in Victorian textile mills, exploring how industrial progress required the destruction of childhood itself. Subscribe to The Wicked Historian to ensure you don't miss these voices that history tried to silence, these stories that reveal uncomfortable truths about human nature that we ignore at our own peril.